Okay, let's give this a go.
Recording Audacity.
James, you lead the way.
Okay, Dick. Welcome to the LIXNAW. What is it? 1752 podcast research project.
Yeah, historical research project. Historical theatre research project.
Okay. I'm here, James Moran, with Shane Connolly.
Hello.
And Dick Walsh.
How are you all doing?
Why don't you say again briefly what the show is, Dick, or the research project?
Okay,
Because
yeah.
people mightn't have listened to the last one, you see.
Okay, so we'll go for it again. It's well, basically we are theatre makers. We've worked together on many different projects, and now we are trying to do a project set in the 18th century in North Kerry, where I'm actually from. Originally LIXNAW, but actually after this interview here and after meeting this man, Joe Harrington, we're going to set the project in Lyra Compound, which would have been like an outskirts of the estate of the Earl of Kerry. And to put it succinctly, basically we are going to deep dive and research everything we can about this period, roughly around 1752, when the project's going to be set in, but 18th century Ireland. We're going to find out about the butter markets, the economy, the influence of Cork City, the growth of international globalism, obviously the ending of the Gaelic Ireland and the introduction of capitalism into the country. And we've gone through already a lot of data, and we're going to continue to go through a lot of data. And eventually we're going to slide off and we're going to make a play, make a story, which we've just started to do. We're at that process of sliding away from history and making a play. And these podcasts and these interviews are a fantastic way of getting as much historical information and as much knowledge as we can that'll help us understand the story of the people from that time.
So for this podcast, we talked to Joe Harrington, who is from Lyra.
That's right.
And he's probably the foremost expert in Lyra history.
Yeah.
He's involved in a history journal on the area.
Mm-hmm.
He's written a few books on the area. He's currently writing a book about the road that goes to Castle Island or somewhere. Yeah,
it goes from, essentially would have been the road that linked Listowel to Castle Island to Cork, which is the epicenter of the butter markets of South Munster. Okay. But yeah, it was built through Lyra Compound. And
so how did you hear about Joe?
He actually came to a showing myself and Shane did, along with a few others, in Listowel just before Christmas, when we were talking about the project that we were doing. And he put his hand up, had some interesting questions, but he also had this interesting anecdote about a guy called Darby Carty, who was a valet for the Earl of Kerry. And at around this time, when the Earl died in 1748, he was given 1,000 acres of land in Lyra Compound. And roughly around the time when the road is actually just before when the road was built through it. So in a way, that's all we know about this guy Darby Carty, is that he was a valet and then he became like a guy who owned 1,000 acres.
Well, just to be clear, he didn't own it.
Oh, he was given a tenancy. Yes.
He was given a tenancy. Just to be
it's good to be accurate.
Yeah, okay. Good to be accurate. Yeah. So it's a tenancy for 3 lives. So
yes.
Nobody.
But that in itself, it's almost like owning it for him.
At the time, yeah, the only people who owned land were, of course, large, big earls and people who had tens of thousands of acres. So yeah, he had a very large tenancy, and yeah, we don't know much more about him as a character, but we can start to speculate. His story must have been fascinating, and also he was right there at the point where. In the 18th century, a lot of land started to be reclaimed using new advancements in technology, and also the development of these global markets started to have their effect across rural Ireland and across the world, really, in terms of reclaiming land and commonage was being reclaimed. And
so Joe was sort of immediately interested in the project.
Yeah, I was, and I was interested in him because he had the same angle. He didn't seem to have this like prejudicial obsession with like Catholicism or anti-Catholicism or the English versus the Irish, or he just had this like pragmatic interest in the history of the area, which resonated with me. It was non-judgmental. I felt very non-judgmental. Yeah.
So I met him twice. You met him once for this project.
Yeah.
He gave us a tour of LIXNAW, and then later on I met him to record the interview.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were sort of different experiences because he was really bringing us around, showing us the whole area.
Mm-hmm.
And even he said to me when he was, maybe before the interview, he said like, he talks best when he's like in the area and when he can see it.
Yeah. Even during the interview, he starts talking about looking out the window at things, doesn't he?
Exactly, yeah.
Stuff, yeah.
Like one of the things I liked when he was showing us was these two fields that dated from, I think, around this time.
Yeah.
From the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was pointing at the fields, and then he was also at 3 maps sort of demonstrating how the fields had changed or not changed since they were made.
Yeah.
And I think it was a bit lost on me, but earlier when we were recording this, you and Shane were talking about what that meant, like what you thought that meant.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was fascinating because, especially growing up in a rural community, it's as if it has always existed, like especially lands you see passed from father to son, it seems always be go from one generation to the next. It's inherited, people very rarely become farmers because they chose it on the leaving cert, and you get the feeling that things have always been that way. And I think Joe as well was interested in this period because you see when it was new and these farmland that maybe he grew up in, like it's very clear when it was made, which I think is fascinating, that there was a time that this was a new thing when people came in and built those drains and built those ditches. And and me too, I'm interested in that point that it is new, especially nowadays when we're trying to understand the world. It's changing so much that now things are they're new, and it's good to think of that. Yeah.
But you were thinking, Shane, it was almost like the opposite, where he was demonstrating how old the area was. Is that right?
I think that's the sense I got of it. I guess the more I think about it since that last conversation we had, is perhaps, yes, maybe it was talking more about, he was zoning in more about where we were thinking about with the 18th century. So perhaps, yes, perhaps more he was trying to show us something of that time, showing those fields that were created of that time. But I got a sense of him wanting to show a sense of society that had been around for a long time, a settled sense of society. That's, again, maybe that's just something that was occurring inside my head. But I got that impression that he was trying to show us the ancient is probably too strong of a word perhaps, but the longevity of settlement inside Lyrac-Bron.
Yeah, and that was all contrasted with the road. He's writing this book about the road. And the road was really like a new form, not a new form, but technology that was brought into the area. Because back in the day, if you wanted to bring the butter to the market, you just had to walk across a field. Whereas now, there was like a technology imposed in the area.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, even from this is not in this interview that we're going to listen to, but when we met him the first time, he did talk about that everything was brought into the area with horses and carts, but the carts didn't have wheels. Because
that was wild, wasn't it?
It's amazing that it was just dragged along just because of the steepness of the trails and things like that. Wheels just wouldn't have worked because they would have, been out of control going either up or down the hill. And so they were dragged along with these poles and they would wear away and they would get replaced and everything. But, as you say, when the road is being made, or as the road is being made, there's a real sense of change. I think that's one of the things that we're interested in, perhaps in the project, is we're trying to see that sense of change, a big change happening. We look back and we see this big change, but it's small incremental changes. But the building of a road, or indeed Derby getting access to 1,000 acres, they're quite significant changes. Even when dealt in just those one things. They're quite significant.
Okay, will we get onto it? Because I think he starts with a history of the whole area, which is a fantastic, like ancient history is where we start. So will we just get into it?
As you could see, LIXNAW is a very upland, what we call upland area. We're up here off the low ground of North Kerry. North Kerry would be a very low-lying plain. And apart from Cunnacanore, most of it would be barely above sea level. The field that flows through it is a fairly slow river because it's on the flat there. But then when you begin to move south, to the southern part of North Kerry, put it that way, you're heading towards Castle Island, and the ground begins to rise. And up here in LIXNAW, we'd be in a bit of altitude, probably about 500 feet above sea level. A lot of it, there'd be hills and valleys, of course, but it would be up in a place where I reckon that the season, compared with, we'll say, Listowel, would start about 10 days later and finish. The summer would finish about 10 days earlier.
Right.
On average, you could see the difference. I used to work in Limerick and I used to drive, so I was observing that as I was driving along different times of the year. You could see the difference because of the altitude here and the maybe a bit harsher weather in general.
It's harsher up here, is it?
It would be harsher in general up here, although I like the weather up here myself in a way. You do get higher rainfall, obviously. You do. There's no doubt about that. You do. Well, because this area is blanket bog, and blanket bog would never have appeared on the horizon, so to speak, if you didn't have a high rainfall.
Okay, it's just the way it. Oh, you were saying that it's about the minerals sort of going down.
Yeah, I was saying there when we were out the last day that how bog and moorland was formed, that it was, for the most part, it was human intervention. A lot of people don't see it that way. They think bog is natural, and it is, I suppose, in its own way. But what happened was that after the Stone Age, not the Stone Age, the Ice Age ended, the ice withdrew and the island began to grow trees.
Okay.
The seed was probably in the ground, I would imagine, rather than being washed in, and it germinated again, and trees grew all over the island, massive amount of trees, and then people began to come back to the island, and basically they discovered when they came back, the short story would be that their implements couldn't cut the big trees that had grown on the good land down low, so they went up into high ground, like in the Cage fields above in Mayo, and places like this, and they cut down the smaller trees that had grown here because of the high altitude. The trees hadn't grown as well, as good and as big, so they cut them down and they exposed the ground to the high rainfall. At the same time, the records do show that there was the weather disimproved, and there was more rain than usual, and bad weather. And it was the combination of that, exposing the ground to the elements and the increase in the rainfall, that washed out the minerals in the ground down a few inches down and sort of formed a pan that stopped water seeping away and caused waterlogging. And it was in those waterlogged conditions that the heather and the rushes and those rough sort of plants grew and died and grew and died, and eventually in some places around here would be up to 6 feet deep.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of bogland. So obviously the people that cut down the trees begin to move down the mountain and down to the lowlands as their implements got better and they cleared land in better places.
Yeah.
And then I suppose not literally, but you could say they looked back up the mountain and saw the bog following them down. and then they discovered that they could burn it. They could burn the turf, so they had heating coming on the mountains up here, and they were able to live down in the lower ground where the weather was better.
Okay.
Now, that's a very simplistic sort of a picture of the thing, but it's pretty accurate, I think. That's basically how we wound up with a landscape like we have.
Yeah, and is that seen as a good thing? Like, so the people living in the lowlands, and they're farming, presumably, were they?
Say again?
The people in the lowlands, that was sort of farmland, was it?
Oh, yeah.
So we're talking about...
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be an expert now on that. But obviously, I would think that if there were hunters, there would be more game down in where the big forests really were and the good land was and the good grass was and all that.
Yeah.
And if they were inclined to farm, obviously, that would be better down there as well. So... But in Mayo, where the best example of it is in the Cajun fields, when they investigated below the surface there, they discovered that there was walls built of stone that had been gathered, and that there were fields there.
Yeah.
And those fields became overgrown with bogland, with peat.
I see, yeah.
Yeah. So the same thing would have happened in other places as well. Probably less likely that it would happen this far from the sea here in Harrington, but there is some evidence that it may have there may have something like that may have happened here as well. There is just a mile from us here. There is the remains of a stone ditch that some people think go back to that time.
Okay, yeah. Really.
Also, there definitely was people around here back 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Back, we'd say in the end of the Bronze Age. The Lyre find, which is in the museum in Dublin, it is a round stone ring, about 10 centimetres in diameter, and it was found just half a mile from where we are now here in Lyre.
Okay.
And it is estimated to be 3,000 to 4,000 years old.
Right.
By the museum, and if you go to the National Museum in Dublin, you'll actually be shown it.
Yeah.
The other thing then is that was found around here was bog butter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just a mile from us here to the west, in Banmore, in the 1970s, there was bog butter found there.
Okay.
And that was recorded, and it's in the museum in Dublin as well. And the notes of the time about it were taken, are still available there, where it was found and who found it and all that.
Yeah.
And actually, I used to know the guy that found it.
Did you?
He's dead now, but he was old when I used to cut turf beside him.
Oh yeah.
Our bank of turf was next to his. So he found that, and it was taken to the museum. Just across the way there is where Borden and Mona used to cut turf. There was bog butter found there as well in the 40s. Okay. And that was sent over to Holland to be carbon dated. Yeah. And that shows as well that it was, can't remember the exact dates now, but it was 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Okay. Yeah.
There's obviously a lot going on. Like if you have 3 or 4 discoveries like that.
Yeah, you would think that. The only thing I think about it is that of all the places around in Ireland, or around North Kerry, that has been excavated most, it's Lyre because the turf has been cut here. A lot of turf has been cleared, and you have a lot of bog holes, as we call them, that have gone down to the original surface. Okay. And not much has been found. Right. That's the thing. Now, that may be because people didn't know what they were looking at when they got down to that level. Yeah. And things may have been lost or not noticed. So that's one of the things. In more recent times, machines have been used to cut turf, and they are totally discriminatory. I mean, they just grab everything, and you could lose very important things.
Isn't that what happened to the bog bodies? Isn't that what happened to the bog bodies? Wasn't one of them cut in half by a machine?
I don't know that, but I would believe it as possible. That would have been up the Midlands, I would say. Yeah. So you'd have that problem, all right.
So we're doing this project in the 1700s, right? Would there have been continuous people, would there have people been living here continuously between, I can't say for sure, but between, say, 3,000 years ago and the 1700s?
Yeah. One of the problems that we have, I think, is that it's difficult to know. One of the unfortunate things, or fortunate things, depending which way you look at it, was that the Down survey wasn't used here. This place wasn't surveyed in the Down survey in the 1600s because the Earl of LIXNAW, the Earl of Kerry, the guy in LIXNAW, he was on the right side of history that time in terms of holding on to his domain.
Okay.
So it was the areas and the chieftains that were removed by the English at that stage. Their areas were surveyed, and the land was parcelled up and given out to the soldiers or that had fought for no pay for the English. They were compensated that way, and others as well. And it was they came in, and the plantations of Munster and all that took place. So you had that was one of the things that happened. That meant that if that had happened here, we'd have a better record of what the place was like back that time.
Yeah.
But we don't.
Okay.
So when you look at the map of the Down survey, there's a big blank area around this area because it wasn't surveyed, unfortunately.
Because those Fitzmaurices were holding on to it, was it?
They were holding on to it. They didn't lose their land. So that was the thing. And that was interesting, I think, that happened. But unfortunately, it leaves a hole in the record.
Yeah.
After that, then, you can imagine, I suppose, that because it was upland, the population would have been small, if any. The way in, given the lack of roads in, would have been along by the rivers, we reckon.
Okay.
Because along by rivers, you tend to get hard ground and where you can walk or have a pack horse or whatever to get into a place.
Yeah, I suppose it's just easier to conceptualise as well. Like, a river is almost like a road, really, isn't it?
Well, it is in that fashion. It's a thing that, well, obviously you can follow it, and it's a direction finder in its own way.
So where does the river lead? Like, where was the nearest?
The nearest river, there was a couple of them coming in here that obviously people, I think, followed. The river Smearle flows from beyond Lyrican Pond there, between here and Castleisland, and it flows north, for the most part, into the field, just east of the Stole.
Yeah.
So, obviously, east of the Stole would have been reasonably populated at that time. And if people were adventurous or wanted more land or wanted to get out of the limelight for some reason, I would imagine they would be heading up along the Smearle.
Okay.
And they'd be working their way. And the other thing that would entice people along the river would have been the fact that the river overflowing numerous times over the centuries caused a thing called inches. That's areas of flat land beside the river that the flood had carried soil over in flood times, deposited it there, and it had built up maybe a foot of good soil, good ground that people could use. They weren't very big areas, but they were pretty fertile, and they didn't require a whole pile of work to actually make them work in terms of producing stuff. So and that would have been an attraction too, to find those along the river, and I would imagine that you would be inclined to follow that to see if you could find more of those. And one of the biggest ones is actually in Lyrican Pond, which would be 10 miles up from the Smearle.
Okay.
And we were over the other day, and we were standing. It's where the
GAA
community centre and the GAA. Well, it's not a GAA pitch officially, but a football pitch. That's where that is. That's about there's a good few acres there, and that was one of the inches. That was good land. After that, then any land up here that was to be turned into good land had to be enclosed and worked on. So there was no natural meadow land up here.
So if you were following the river, you might find
that.
A bit of good land.
You definitely would find it all the way along.
And would you have to be given that land, or?
I wouldn't know that for sure. I mean, officially the Earl of Kerry owned all from LIXNAW and east and west of it, but also up along the Smearle, south of it, heading south towards Castleisland, up to a place called the Lashorig River, which is the boundary between Kerry and Renagowan, or between the parish of Dewa and LIXNAW and the parish of Ballymacilligot.
Okay.
Ballymacilligot parish was owned by a different landlord.
Right.
So there you had the boundary. That's about 4 miles from here.
Okay. Yeah.
Lettercompan we're in. The next townland is Kerry, and then the next place after that is the Lashaleg River, which is the boundary.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of land up here, probably several thousand acres, that was at the moorland, wasn't divided into farms in any proper way. So whether the Earl was getting rent off of small little places up along the river, it's hard to say. There's no record that he was, put it that way.
Yeah. It might have just been not worth his time.
It wouldn't be worth his time, and he mightn't even have known about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because of obviously that time. I mean, even later times, tenants that were evicted or that were pushed out in some fashion or just overpopulated the land they were in, used to go into areas that, like bogland, and build houses or shacks there.
Okay.
And they'd be left there because that land wasn't of any use, and there was no chance of getting rent off them anywhere, like, you know.
So they, so you would almost imagine, by the principle of the thing, that they'd run the people off the land altogether. But like, he was happy for people to live on the bogland that he couldn't use. So
that was the case. Now,
really?
At times, but after the famine, they actually did clear them off the land.
Really?
They did. A lot of the landlords paid to move them to America or Australia. They actually paid their fare to get them out.
Okay.
Or others they just evicted and let people find their own way. Other agencies tried to help them to immigrate, but there was massive immigration in the 1850s, and a lot of it was people who were living in what I suppose were really rural slums of the time, in desperate conditions. Desperate conditions, and of course the landlord, there was a bit of land tied up, and they were a draw on him because the workhouses that they would have maybe been fed from, some of them, they had to be funded, and the landlord would be funding some of that.
Okay.
So there was all sorts of reasons why the landlord wanted to get rid of them.
Yeah.
So that's how they went. But that was in more later times. That would be in the 1800s. In 1700s, I don't think there's any records to show about places that are the out-of-the-way places and how people might have lived in them.
Okay.
There are plenty of records for the big farms that he had well established the boundaries of down in North Kerry. There, the Julian papers, his agents' correspondence that he had with him when he was in Paris and England. They've still survived, and they're in Paris in a library there, and they're available. There's a massive amount of them there, but luckily they survived. And one of them, for instance, does show that he had what I call an indenture with a guy called Darby Carty.
Okay.
For Lettercompan and Kerry. Kerry was 700 acres, Lettercompan was 400 acres plus. And he reached an agreement with Darby Carty and two others for their lifetimes to take over those two farms. They were basically townlands, but in reality up here townlands were full farms.
Okay.
Afterwards then they were divided. It depends on Darby Carty, for instance. He would have come up here. He would have had a house here probably, but the main thing he would have done for sure was that he would have let parts of the farm, parts of Lettercompan, to other tenants, and they'd be paying him rent, and he'd be then paying the Earl of Kerry rent, but he'd have the extra little bit in the middle. So he'd be able to. He was sort of a middleman. So
before that, were the farmers paying rent directly to the Fitzmaurice?
No. I would think that Darby Carty, there might have been some up here that might have been maybe not paying rent at all, but they certainly were roped in when Darby Carty got
so he came in and put the boot
tenant
down,
of the land.
Okay.
And then others would have been enticed in as well.
come in after him.
Come in after him, because he could have, for instance, Derby Carty, he could have built small houses and other people come in. There are all sorts of ways of trying to get the most they could in terms of money from the land, and it wasn't always in just growing things, it was in actually letting the land to others, because the only way that people had of living that time was to have a bit of land. Conacre, it was called. The land was sort of marginal, a lot of it. It was good enough to grow potatoes, and they were able to grow enough potatoes in that bit of land. I don't know the exact dimensions of it now, but it was so many spades long, the length of a spade, and so many spades wide.
Okay.
And that sort of guaranteed, if you grew that much potatoes, you would have enough, hopefully, for the full year. And then you'd pay a rent as well, obviously, out of that, by selling some of that or selling turf or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were those, so you had there's so many layers, but you had the landlord, like Fitzmaurice. Then you had the tenant, which was Derby Carty.
Derby Carty, and then you had a subtenant.
You had subtenants, and then you had labourers.
You had labourers then that were landless, I suppose you'd say.
Yeah.
Because obviously there were big families among the subtenants, and they had to try to make a living some other way than off the land.
We were talking to John Knightley, and he said there's something like 80% of the population
were labourers.
Yeah.
I don't know that figure now for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. And we're trying to figure out, we're trying to even imagine what it would look like, because the image we're always given is like the farmer has like a stone cottage on his land. But that was the farmer. Where did the labourers hang out?
Well, I would say that a lot of the labourers would have been the sons, or the daughters maybe, but the sons for sure, and would have been in that same house. Others might have had very rudimentary outhouses or whatever.
Right.
It was tough, it was definitely tough times, I would say. And they would have to then try to get some sort of income working for bigger farmers or
a wage, really, would it? It would just been a small wage, would it?
It would be very small.
Yeah.
Very small. One of the things that they probably would have been doing around a place like this would be draining the land.
Okay.
Because the land outside of the inches would have had to be drained to actually be turned into anything approaching a meadow that would produce hay or grass.
Was that tough? Was it tough work?
They had to dig the drains, a lot of them, and then they had to cart the stone. The stone would have been put in a V shape, like a pyramid.
Okay.
So as that the stones at the top leant against each other and held their position and didn't collapse.
Yeah.
And then they'd fill in around that, and basically you'd wind up with a drain that looked like a triangle if you saw it, a profile of it.
Oh, I've seen. I know the idea.
Yeah, and one story that I always tell about that, and it will be a way more recent one, that my mother's brothers, 3 of them went to Australia in the 1920s. When I went to Australia in the 60s, I met one of them.
Yeah.
And he'd never come home, and he told me that before he went, he spent the year digging drains in Sheehy's field. Right, and he never wanted to see the place again after it, right? And when I came home, by pure chance, they were digging a road at the bottom of that field.
Yeah.
And as the machine excavated the road, it exposed the drains that he had made.
Oh, really?
And they were still working.
Wow.
The water was still flowing through them out onto the place where they were making the road. So it just shows you that those drains they had a knack for how they made them, but they were awful vital to the whole thing, because if they didn't have that knack, and if they couldn't keep the drains going open, and they couldn't be opening them every now and then to try to fix them, that was a big part of how the land was turned into some sort of agricultural land up here. The other way that they did it was, of course, the addition of lime, because bogland by its nature would be very acid.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be great for growing a lot of stuff. So they used to bring lime in, and they built kilns which are still in existence.
Does lime come from?
Lime comes from places like LIXNAW.
Does it?
Yeah, from the lowland.
I don't even know what lime is. I know what it looks like.
Lime is just a rock. I was thinking at a particular time. Lime was formed under the sea.
Right.
Over millions of years, basically.
Yeah.
And it's made up of the bodies of all the fish and organisms of every sort that ever lived in the sea that died and fell to the bottom. And if you actually get a bit of limestone and you break it, it'll smell of fish.
Really?
You'll actually get the smell of fish from it,
really?
Believe it or not. Now, it is very hard. It's a brilliant rock. It's the preferred rock for a lot of things because it can be shaped and it's used to build some of the best buildings back over the last 200 years. It can be squared up lovely and it can be used. But they used to bring it in as well in carts into places like Harrington, and they would burn the lime in what they call killins.
Yeah.
The kiln was basically a hole that was about 6 feet deep.
Yeah.
It was faced by, it was built into the side of a bank, and the front of it was stone, and there was a hole at the bottom through the stone, went into the hole that went into the big hole inside.
Yeah.
They then put wood and timber into the hole for about a foot deep. Then they put in the limestone rocks, which they would have broken up to maybe 2-inch stone.
Yeah.
They put that in. Then they'd put in maybe a foot of that. Then they'd put in another foot of timber and turf, maybe coal if they had it. And then they'd build layers like that. And then they'd light it in through the hole at the bottom.
Yeah.
At the front. And that would act like a chimney and would build a massive temperature inside in the kiln.
Yeah.
That would break down the limestone into dust.
Okay.
And they'd then pull that out through the hole at the bottom of the kiln.
And it would be alkaline.
And that would be alkaline.
Okay.
And they'd spread that over the land, and that would improve the land. The other thing that I would do would be they'd go to places like Ballybunion for sand.
Just beach sand?
Beach sand.
Okay.
And they'd bring that now. Ballybunion is 20-odd miles from here.
Yeah.
But people were doing that. And they'd bring the sand and they'd spread it around. They had the theory that the sand would break up the soil to the grains would start to break it up.
Yeah.
But, I think that might have been maybe not true, because actually sand can actually block the pores of soil. But probably what the advantage was that the sand was alkaline as well.
Yes.
And that was probably what they were getting the benefit of rather than the actual making it more porous.
Yeah.
That's just a theory of my own, but so that's the way that's the way the land was improved around here.
And with these sort of things, like we read about I think there was a Dublin Society and the Cork Society, and there were like concerted efforts at land development.
That's right, yeah.
Like ideas of introducing lime or the sand, were they just known? Were they just folk knowledge or people's knowledge?
It's hard to know what came first, the chicken or the egg,
Yeah.
in a sense. There was a bit of both, I would say. I know that the progressive landlords, what you call progressive landlords, like the Earl of Kinmare, who lived in Killarney House in Killarney Town. He had to do with Kinmare, actually.
Okay.
The Kinmare there was a Kinmare in Limerick, that he owned land down that side, and there was a Kinmare castle down there. But he owned massive amount of land, and he was big into, back in the 1700s, in the early 1700s, he was big into lime. And
Really?
he had quarries going, and he had a whole arrangement with his tenants about giving them lime, and it was their job to spread it and all that.
Really?
So I went back that far. But I would think that maybe there were some societies set up then, to, like you're saying, to try to develop the idea and to educate farmers and educate people about what was the best methods to use in building, in making their farmers, the land better. And I'd say that those societies did very good work. I've seen some of the stuff that they've produced. I can't remember off the top of my head now the actual dates for those, but whatever date they were, they certainly did help because they did give they pulled together a lot of knowledge that had been gleaned about how to deal with bad land and stuff, and they let people know how that could be used to their benefit.
So it was like a top-down.
It was, yeah, there was that. But I'd say as well, they learned from the experience that people had developed as well, just at local level, and had figured things out. Because they're, like for instance with lime, you could over-lime a thing, which mightn't be good.
Yeah.
So people over a period figured what the right spread of lime would be and how often it should be used and all that. So there was a lot of information gained about things like that just by doing, you know, by actually carrying out the tasks. And people had the time that time to learn exactly what they were looking at and take it in. I was saying there just about land, and two things about, three things about here. Apart from the river and all that, and the way the farms were brought out, were worked out, one of the things that opened up this was obviously the road that was built from Listowel side up to Castle Island, and that allowed. That was one of the things actually that allowed lime to be transported
the new
to different
road.
farms.
Okay.
Right. And the Earl of Kerry, in several of the documents that we can see, was pointing that out.
Okay.
When he was letting farms, one of the selling points was this is beside the road, the new road, on which lime can be transported. And they had a big understanding that lime was a big thing up here. If you were ever going to make a go of it, you had to have lime. Down in the lowlands, that was limestone already. You didn't have to put lime out in the lowlands down on the store at all. But up here, you had to. So they understood that. So the road provided a way of getting lime around the place. And of course, it provided access to the area, better access. And it allowed the Earl of Kerry, to set about really letting the farms up here in an organised fashion. And it made it easier for him to let the farms because people could get around easier. They didn't have to be on horseback over bogs trying to get to their farms or old tracks along the river, so they had the road. And that made a difference. And that road was going both ways, obviously, as well. It helped the people. And,
so that road is going through to where?
Right through the middle of Lyre-Compine,
okay.
Stax Mountains.
Right.
Right. The upland.
Yeah.
And so that did open up the place.
So was it connecting two areas, or was it just opening up Lyre-Compine?
Well, I suppose it was a road that went on to Castle Island, and I'm from there. It connected into other roads. I'm doing an old thesis on that, and not a thesis, but an account of that road, and I'm in the middle of sorting that out. So I'd probably talk to you about that some other time.
Yeah,
right? Because there is an interesting story there, but we'll have to do a bit more on it.
Oh, yeah.
But for now, the interesting part of it here, definitely in connection with the Earl of Kerry, is that it did help to make his land way more valuable than up here in this area in the upland, way more valuable than it was. He was getting very little out of this place before that road came in.
Yeah, it's sort of funny to think of a road as a technology. Do you know what I mean? Like, in my mind, a road just naturally develops by people walking on it.
Yeah.
But really, in an area like this, where there's no major centre or no major population, I guess it wouldn't develop. The people are just they're just living here.
It wouldn't, and in a lot of places like this, it was much the same. I've read over around Cork, East Cork, and East Kerry there. They talk about the road to Tralee, but I also know that they actually had to have guides.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because there weren't really roads; there were tracks that wandered around the place, trying to pick up on the best hard ground they could to actually travel.
Right.
And they weren't clearly mapped or anything. And some people that wouldn't know the area if they came in from the outside would have to have a guide
Really?
to actually travel those, what they called old roads, but really old roads. They were just tracks that were formed, and they weren't formed very well even because they weren't that used, I would imagine, that time. People didn't have reasons to travel a lot of the time. No real reasons to go into towns and so on. They were different at that time than now.
So the people living here before the road, say, they still had to make a living, so they were selling things like turf or extra crops
or butter, I would say.
So they had cows.
Would be some of them would have a cow maybe, and maybe they'd put them together with a few others, and they'd make enough butter to make it worthwhile taking to the market.
And then they'd leave for the market, would they?
They'd have to go to the market then.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'd say there was very little movement myself. They were up here and they were trying to eke out a living as best they can.
Yeah.
And
is there much account of the culture from that time? Is there much account of the culture? Like, was the language the same here? You know the way sometimes in areas, sort of small language might develop?
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, there's no doubt. I suppose the fact that the whole Slieve Lucre area, we'd be on the edge of what they call Slieve Lucre, which was...
Oh, are we? I didn't realise.
Yeah, we'd be on the edge of it. And, of course, because of the nature of the terrain and the quality of the quality of the land, there weren't big houses and big landlords, for the most part, actually centred in that area.
Yeah.
And because of that, they became areas, if people were in trouble and they were on the run, to be into areas like that, they would go.
Really?
And because there wasn't that much connection with the outside world, they would have preserved or developed a language, and they developed a music of their own, for sure. Like, I mean, the Slieve Lucre music is a specific type of traditional music that you won't find anyplace else.
Yeah.
It is traditional music, but it has its own angle that's very distinctive. And that only happened because there wasn't a big influence of outside into it.
Yeah.
And obviously the people here weren't going out and coming back with influences either.
Okay.
So whether it was the preservation of an old way or whether it was just development in isolation, one way or the other, the Slieve Lucre music. And the old sayings and the way people talk, and even the way people are, you know, the sort of gimp of them and the way they would relate to people there'd be little differences always. But that's true with a lot of communities, whether they're in upland or lowland or whatever. But I suppose in upland places where there's a bit of isolation, they're a bit more stronger. They're more developed, I'd say, a little bit more distinctive and a bit more developed. Like these days, when people travel the world, you know, you can see that the old accent goes.
Oh, yeah.
The old accent is gone.
Yeah.
But the accents in places like this stay because and did stay over those times because there wasn't that much movement, like, you know. So that's an interesting. But that was the road that brought a lot of possibility of development of land and the enclosure of land. And if you look at the map of 1842, which was just before the famine, the Ordnance Survey map of 1842, there was only about 10% of the land up in the Lyre-Crampon area enclosed. And if you look at the land, if you look at the map then of 1898, the next Ordnance Survey map they did, the percentage is up to over 25%.
Okay.
And if you look at the land today, it would be much more again. So there was a development there. Whereas if you look at the map of North Kerry from before the famine, from 1842, practically all the fields that are there today were there then.
Okay.
The development had been carried out already. The land had been enclosed because of the big population down there. But up here, you can see that the land was originally very open moorland and then eventually was enclosed.
And so if it wasn't enclosed, was it a bit of a free-for-all? Like, could you...
There was up here one particular place, Clahan, back the road there, where there was a sort of a village developed. Now, this would have been in more recent times, like the late 1800s. And a sort of a village, it wouldn't have been a street now, but there was 5 or 6 houses there in a square mile. And they didn't own it. They were the tenants in common. They held it in common as a place of the landlord.
Okay.
They all had the same input into it.
Right.
And they used to enclose fields whenever they could. They'd cut the turf and they'd go and put sand in or they'd put lime in. And each of them made their own field.
Yeah.
And it became a patchwork of fields with no two fields owned by the same person together.
Right.
Well, not owned would be the wrong word. They would have been the tenants of the landlord, and the landlord would have officially owned them. But then in the 1900s, obviously, that all changed and they became the owners. And then I'd say it was the 1960s before they actually got together and they exchanged fields so that they could have more. It would make a bit more sense in terms of being able to work their own land in the one spot. So that was in more recent years that they managed to do that. But that was the Rundale system, they called that. I don't know much about it, but it was sort of where a village sort of has land in common, and they work it between them, and they, at the same time they all work out the little bits they want themselves and develop them.
Yeah, I've heard that's almost based on Breton law. All that. That
probably would be something like that. I wouldn't be good at that now, but that goes back a long way. That would go back to the Irish way of doing things, I would say, before Cromwell did the damage and all that, like, you know.
But they say the issue is that it's... Sorry, what?
I'm just looking out the window there. See the pheasant?
No.
Don't move too fast now.
Oh, yeah.
Just outside the window we have a pheasant. That's a Lyra Compaan pheasant. We have about 6 or 7 of them.
Oh, yeah?
Come up there and we feed them. Now, they're not pals of ours. The very minute we'd move, they'd disappear.
Yeah.
But they know about the feeding and they come up there twice a day.
Okay.
And they had 10 chicks. There's, I'd say about 6 of them have survived.
Right.
And they come up there feeding as well. They're now like hens. They're big.
Yeah.
And they have survived. And it's nice to have them there near us.
Yeah, they're great birds, aren't they?
Yeah. Now, one of the things that will bring us to one other small thing, which of course was that a lot of this area, even as it was developed, still remained as open moorland and bogland. And some of the landlords would have shooting rights on it.
Okay.
And they would have the rights to shoot pheasant and grouse,
right? And
I suppose some animals too. And some of those rights still actually exist.
Oh, yeah?
In the deeds of places here that were never properly corrected.
Yeah.
And landlords that no longer exist. But maybe their descendants don't know that they might have the right to come up here and shoot that pheasant. I came across one of them recently. Kay was going there through some folios of local land.
Yeah.
And down at the bottom was the shooting rights belonging to, I think it was Blenner Hassett.
Okay, General Hassett.
Blenner Hassett.
Okay.
There was a guy from, he was the landlord of Rainagown of Ballymackelligot.
Right.
And he'd have been in Tralee.
Yeah.
But some of the land that he owned, now he no longer owns it. That's all gone. Like that was in the 1900s. The 1900s, that was all sold off, and he got his cut out of it, and the farmers took over.
Work away. I'll dispose of. Back in the day, in the 1700s, the landowner had the shooting rights. Did that mean that the farmers and the labourers didn't?
No, they hadn't, and there was a lot of cases, and people were evicted because obviously that the tenants and the labourers and anybody else, and the fishing rights as well, of course.
Okay.
Would have been included. That was a cause of conflict. They used to have what they call wood rangers and bog rangers and local people that were bailiffs that would work for the landlord to mind all that. And which is very hard to mind that sort of stuff from people around here, I can tell you.
Yeah, I was wondering, how would they catch people? Like, it'd be hard enough to catch them now, do you know?
Yeah.
But if you were, there's no roads or no,
I know.
you're on horseback.
Yeah, they did. There were cases, though, they're on record where they did catch up with people, but we won't go down that road too much now because a lot of stories about people being caught, but and the excuses that they gave when they were caught.
Oh, yeah.
But I'd say for the most part, the landlord couldn't possibly mind all what he considered his game to be.
Yeah.
He shouldn't have had the right in the first case. I suppose one of the only things that you could say about it is that if he hadn't the right to have the right to shoot game,
Yeah.
then I'd say there'd be no game left ever.
Really?
At least if he came up here in organised shoots or organised fishing trips, there were only odd occasions.
Yeah.
The game was protected the rest of the time. It meant that there was game up here. He was not going to undermine that. But I'd say if he had not had the right to do that,
Yeah.
I'd say there would have been very little left up here.
They would have stripped it, do you
They
think?
would have been stripped. It would have been because poor people will always have to do what they have to do
Yeah.
to survive. So I'd say that would have been the case. So there's for and against in some cases with
Yeah.
landlords.
So you think the threat was enough that people avoided? Like, you think people avoided poaching because the threat of the landlord was realistic?
That would be
Really?
that would be the saving grace in terms of keeping some sort of wildlife secure in the area. Yeah, obviously some people, for religious reasons and all that, some people, even if they're dying of hunger, they won't take what they see as somebody else's. That's
true.
the culture and heritage of the places. Like that the landlord was the boss, and sure, that's the way nature intended it.
Is that how they thought?
That's
really?
the way that a lot of people would think.
Okay.
And they'd be tipping the cap to the landlord. Others then would be more rebellious.
Yeah.
So you have the whole spectrum of people. The church wasn't very helpful in terms of encouraging rebellion. They always, for the most part, they encouraged subservience to the landlord. That was the way things were.
Really?
And
That's funny, because you would have thought, like, the church were dispossessed, Mm-hmm. You'd think they'd be...
Well, once again, you're talking about, depending on when you're talking about. Obviously, the penal laws, a lot of the priests had to leave the place.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of stuff went on like that. But in more recent times after that, going into the 1800s, coming up to the famine times, the clergy came back with a vengeance.
Really?
And there was an awful lot of clergy. The numbers of people that joined the priesthood at that time and the nuns was incredible. The numbers of priests per head of the population went from, from maybe one for every couple of thousand to one for every few hundred.
Okay.
So there was a big turnout, and they really laid down the law.
Yeah.
And even though that the landlords and the authorities would have been Protestant, the real power in the country was, in terms of local people, were the church. The church decided everything.
But that was later. That was from
the famine time, just before the famine onwards.
Right.
Yeah.
But
forward.
in the mid-1700s, the impression I get is that they were sort of half lax. Or maybe there was a lot of people not marrying, living together.
I would agree with that. The level of involvement with religion back then would have been small, I think. If you go way back, of course, you're the elder saints and scholars and all that.
Yeah.
But once the priest was removed, I suppose, to some extent, and I'd say even before that, when the Irish were still hanging on a bit there, the religion had dropped out of being a major thing.
Okay.
But after the penal laws then put it out of the question to a great extent. And in all that period until the priests began to come back in again and began to rule the roost, a lot of people, I'd say, were pretty lax. I would say to be much like it is today, not that many people going to Mass.
Really?
And not that many people being that serious about religion. We might have gone back to
it
was before. I hadn't thought about that now before, but I think that might be...
That's interesting.
Would be, But anyway, to go back to the land for 1 minute, just out the window there, a place called Clough-Boola, just that mountain you can see there. That's a good example of how land was used in this area. If you go back to the time of the Earl of Kerry, the tenant that would have been there, anybody that would have been up there at that time or towards the end of his reign, and there was people up there definitely towards the end of his time, they would have burnt the mountain.
Yeah.
Each year they would, to make the grass grow better, they would have had the cows out on it, the cattle.
They set fire to
the mountain, literally, and burned it to be controlled. They were very good at that. And they would then put the cows out in it. They'd probably make butter, or they'd sell the cows, or whatever they did to make an income. Then they sold it in the 1930s to Bord-na-Mona.
Yeah.
And Bord-na-Mona took 250,000 tonnes of turf off that mountainside from the 30s to the 60s. And then the forestry came in, Creedley came in, and they planted it. And all the plantation that they did in the 60s has now grown up into trees and has been carted off out of the area.
Yeah.
And then you look up at it again, and there are the turbines up there now. So that sort of a timeline shows that I think that even in a place like this where you have just moorland, land that people were nearly ashamed to say they owned often, for every square metre of that, we say, take a square metre of it, and the income that was got off that over the years was as good, I think, as any square metre of value that was got out of the square metre in the Golden Vale, in the good land.
Yeah.
It was always possible to find a use, no matter what type of land it was, to make find a use that would bring an income from it.
Yeah.
That's a very clear example over there. That mightn't have been the example everywhere now, but that's a good example of an upland hillside that has made money as long as it's been there nearly. Yeah. In some fashion.
Yeah, that's nice. I think that's a nice place to leave it. It's a nice thought to leave it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
But thanks very much for doing this.
Yeah, so I think we've covered as much as we can from the point of view of the land use.
Yeah.
And the telephone tells us that we should go.
I'll let you get to it.
Thank you.